For the News and Observer, I'm Brian Murphy, your host for this episode of Under the Dome. For the next few weeks, in addition to our twice-a-week schedule of regular podcasts, we'll be hosting a special edition of Under the Dome focused on another podcast. Yes, it's all very meta. There's a new podcast from Serial and the New York Times called The Improvement Association, which is focused on Bladen County and the 2018 election fraud in the 9th Congressional District election there. So when they release a new episode, we will release a new episode talking about some aspect of the event or the episode. Think of ours as a companion piece. This is episode 3. Episode 3 of the Serial podcast focuses on allegations made against the Bladen Improvement Association PAC, a group of Black Democrats led by Horace Munn. I'm joined today by the Insider's Colin Campbell, who interviewed Zoe Chase, the reporter and host for the Serial podcast. And this is a good time to discuss her because she spends a lot of time talking in episode 3 about her investigation, her reporting, her theories. So welcome aboard, Colin.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Now, let's start there. You spoke with Zoe earlier this month, and we have some clips. Let's start with how she talks about using fraud allegations as a weapon in Bladen County.
They get brought into it because election fraud accusations are often wielded at each other from some of the white political establishment at the Black political establishment and right back. But there's basically what I'm trying to say is there's like a deep distrust that exists, at least in the political realm, between white and Black. That's historical. And so election fraud accusations in that context can be used as weapons.
Yeah, so in that clip, I mean, it definitely is a theme of this whole thing is that it seems like this issue in Bladen is this back and forth between, when McCrae Dowless and the folks working for the Mark Harris campaign got caught, they wanted to point out this other group working on behalf of mostly Democrats, the Bladen County Improvement Association, was allegedly doing the same thing. Of course, Zoe Chase's investigation so far seems to indicate that, they didn't really, they were investigated and they didn't ultimately do anything wrong that was established in this. And this is such a common thing in politics these days. I mean, you and I experience this when we write a story that, is critical of one politician or the other. The response from, the political party whose politician doesn't look so good in a news article is not to defend that politician. It's always to be like, well, what about the other political party who did this thing? Why are you not writing about that? And I mean, this is sort of the same thing at a local level, because it seems like, everybody she talks to in Bladen that's, associated with McCrae Dowless and the folks that got caught, it's always, well, why aren't you looking into this other side? And then she does pretty extensively, it sounds like, and, doesn't really come up with anything, all that nefarious, at least in terms of what the law says.
And this is not new. I covered every minute of the 2018, or I guess it was in 2019, the state board hearing about this, and that was and the run up to it, and that was the defense even back then was you shouldn't be looking at McCrae Dowless, you should be looking at this Bladen County Improvement Association. And if you've been following the Serial podcast, this goes back to the 2010 election for sheriff in Bladen County, and what it at least as a somewhat interested outsider, and I covered a little bit of it, you get this sense that it just sort of escalates and escalates from 2010 to 2012 to 2016, and finally, kind of culminating in 2018. But one of the first things she investigates, during this podcast is some allegations about a nursing home in Bladen County. She talks to an investigator for the state board who looked into these allegations. What I found so fascinating and why where she talks about fraud allegations being used as a weapon is it's really hard to disprove something. Especially if everyone in town believes it. You can say, well, I talked to this person and this person and this person. Here's the facts. Here's what I found. But it seems like nobody believes it.
Yeah, and that's what's fascinating, too, is, the Bladen County Improvement Association, as Zoe Chase mentions in the podcast, came up as a, potential thing to look into during the 2018 election hearings. And they evidently did look into that after the fact, and nothing came of it. But I don't remember, maybe you may have seen something, but I don't remember ever seeing a big press release from the State Board of Elections saying, hey, we've looked at this group and we've pretty much exonerated them. They didn't do anything wrong. It was just sort of left out as this lingering source of suspicion, and they never really got formally cleared in any way that I can recall.
Yeah, and we've seen this even to this day as the podcast has come out. A key Republican aide in the state legislature, and you know a little bit more about this than I do, has basically said, "Look, this serial podcast kind of proves that the Bladen County Improvement Association broke some laws." There was back and forth on Twitter between this aide and the serial producers, and I'll let you explain it. But if the thought of that this started in 2010 and ended in 2018. That is wrong. It may have started in 2010, but it has not ended.
Yeah, because so much of the sort of semantics about what did or didn't happen in Bladen County feeds into the changes in the election law here in North Carolina, and this is sort of where this exchange on Twitter comes in about the podcast. So this is Brent Woodcocks, who pretty well-known conservative figure on Twitter, but he's a top advisor to state legislative leaders here in North Carolina. He's been really active as an advisor on election law policy. So in a sense, he's at least had a hand in crafting a lot of the election legislation here. And so he's accusing Serial of essentially uncovering criminal activity on the part of the Improvement Association, but not understanding the law well enough to call that out for what it was. And so he's saying that essentially in one of the episodes where the Improvement Association admits that they would get a stack of absentee ballot request forms that they had solicited from different folks in the community, and they would drop that off at the Board of Elections office. He's saying, well, obviously that's patently illegal. They should be investigated for that. But I went back and listened to the podcast, and it seems like when she's referring to that particular incident, that scenario, it's actually years and years ago, and the law only changed in response to the 2018 scandal to where now, either you yourself have to go drop that request form off in person, or it has to be like a close relative. It can't be some sort of community group that got a stack of 20 of them and is bringing them all in at once. So as long as that didn't happen in the 2020 election, which doesn't seem to be spelled out as being the case in the podcast, they're probably okay on that, having done that in the past. But that, again, comes in where the suspicion and stuff is created. So there was some clarification made by the Serial folks in response to this Twitter thread. But again, it just, there's so much stuff in the law that can sort of play into that. And that sort of brings to another clip of one of the things I asked Zoe in the interview we did a couple weeks ago was, what is it about Bladen County, North Carolina specifically, that makes it such a fertile ground for this type of election fraud scandal? And one part of her answer was about North Carolina specifically and just how the law keeps changing. And you've got these what are essentially gig economy workers, both for McCrae Dallas's group and also for the Improvement Association, who are just, making a few bucks an hour to be involved in these get out the vote operations. And that creates this confusion. So I'll let her explain how that plays into this.
This is like a North Carolina thing. The rules have changed a lot in voting in North Carolina, like even just like there was a moment where you had to have 2 witnesses on an absentee ballot. And then because of COVID, it changed to 1. And just when rules keep changing like that, and you have just like, people who are regular people who have regular jobs or regular lives, like trying to thread the needle on all of those rules, I think that is then like fertile ground for people to make mistakes. And then if somebody's making a mistake and then somebody else is doing something that's actually criminal, like if they can sort of like try to cover it up as a mistake, like the actual voting procedures, I think, because this is probably true in other states, it's just that I know about North Carolina, because the voting procedures have changed, like that can like trip people up,
So yeah, I think that's a key part of it, and it's part of the reason this sort of whole thing I think is going to continue, because you have election law changes every couple of years. There's been a proposal this year that has not made its way through the legislature, but probably will, involving the deadline for absentee ballots to be received at the Board of Elections. That was a big issue in the 2020 election in North Carolina. Republicans want to make sure the Elections Board can't change the deadline in response to an emergency in the future. So that's going to be a big fight this year. And it's probably going to create some more confusion among these people on the ground who don't necessarily know the ins and outs of the law and, maybe interpreting them incorrectly and ultimately breaking the law.
And one reason that this podcast is so timely is that we just went through all this in 2020 at the presidential level.
Exactly. I mean, it's the same. The allegations back and forth, and the allegations sort of become the truth in the absence of a really definitive, oh, hey, this didn't happen. This group is not responsible. Because like Zoe Chase says in the podcast, it's a whole lot easier to throw out the accusations than it is to definitively disprove them and say with 100% certainty nothing nefarious happened here.
I watched a documentary on the QAnon, conspiracy, but it sort of feeds into some of this. And I'm not saying this is QAnon, but when everything becomes, well, that you just didn't look far enough, or that judge, there were all these cases about election fraud in 2020. Well, that judge is a Democrat. Like, everything becomes a reason for the conspiracy theory to be believed, as opposed to evidence that it's not true. And that's what I think you hear if you listen to this episode of Serial. She talks to the person who investigated the claim. He says he talked to the nursing home. He says he talked to this person and that person, and has like definitive proof that this didn't happen. But that's not good enough for the people making the allegations. They think that he's biased. They think that Zoe Chase is biased, or she hasn't looked hard enough, or they think it made it up to the elections board and they didn't do enough. Like there's even evidence that you would seem to contradict the allegation just becomes more evidence of the cover up and the wider scheme.
Yeah, and that's where I think it's going to be really hard at a national level to restore, bipartisan trust in the whole election system. Is that there's just always going to be that. But what about this? But did you look into that? And was that person really doing their job? Did they look at it thoroughly? Because I'm not convinced they can prove to me that allegation X didn't happen. And I don't know where that sort of stuff ends. I think we're kind of going to be stuck with this for at least the next few election cycles, if not, well into the future.
Yeah. And it's somewhat, as a member of the press, as you are, it's somewhat dangerous when facts aren't, and we can argue over what facts are, but when you present what you think is the truth, and that's only taken as more evidence of a cover up, it makes it very difficult.
And I feel like you get even more of a blowback if you present something in sort of the fact check, PolitiFact type formats. I mean, you watch a fact check article get skewered on social media because people just get really angry that you called their side false and tried to make a objective, definitive claim about a particular thing that was said. So it's really hard to who can be the ultimate arbiter on these things. I think the answer is probably no one. No one has that level of authority and that level of respect and credibility to be able to completely say, yeah, you say this thing happens, absolutely without a doubt did not happen.
And that's sort of what has fed this entire thing in Bladen County. If you've listened to the first 3 episodes, there have been whispers on both sides that the Improvement Association has been doing this, and that was sort of used as justification for what I assume is going to come in the next few episodes, and that's the 2018 case. And even before that, as somebody who covered what happened in 2018, you only had to look back to 2016 and see that the candidate associated with McCrae Dowless got an inordinate number of absentee ballots in his election. Now, he didn't win. I think he finished 3rd, and that's why it didn't become a national story. But the seeds of what happened in 2018 certainly go back to 2010, as this podcast points out. But in 2016, it was pretty obvious what was happening as well.
Yeah, and that was the whole, it came up where McCrae Dowless was actually making the allegation about the Improvement Association over, if you remember back to that was when Pat McCrory was losing by a narrow margin. The election hadn't been called in favor of Roy Cooper. And so McCrory and the Republican Party were looking for examples of people who had, voted improperly. And Bladen County was one of the ones they seized on. And in fact, that was when I first encountered Zoe Chase. She was down here to report that story. So that was her first introduction to North Carolina. She actually got breakfast with me at Big Ed's to discuss the case before she went down to Bladen to start doing her first round of reporting. And here we are almost 5 years later, and she's still reporting on the same thing, and it's still making waves from this relatively small county. I went down there to hit the state park a couple weeks ago for my first recreational visit to that area, and it's really small. It's a tiny portion of North Carolina's population to make such big waves on sort of the statewide and national election scene.
One of the things that she points out in this episode, and it sort of culminates, is that she talks about one of the reasons she wanted to do this podcast is that during that hearing, and I was there every day, there was a very brief mention of the Bladen Improvement Association. Lisa Britt, who was related, I guess, a stepdaughter of McCrae Dowless, testified that Horace Munn, who leads the Bladen Improvement Association, I know there's a lot of characters here, but that he had been in McCrae Dowless's office. Now they're sort of sworn enemies, at least in the political arena, and it would seem very strange that Munn and Dowless were working together or were having any interactions at all during an election. That struck Zoe Chase as very odd, and that seems to be the impetus for her doing this podcast. We'll play a clip from her right now where she talks about that being one of her biggest unanswered questions.
I would say the central thing that I didn't understand was like this allegation or implication that somehow these groups had been coordinating, whatever you call them, McCrae's group of workers and this other organization. It did not comport with what I knew about the police at all. So that was probably my biggest question, and it is the person that called me to come to Bladen and sort of explain why his group had been implicated in that hearing was the leader of the Bladen Improvement Association PAC. And he was like, I have answers for you to your biggest question out of the hearing.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting that she saw that as one of the big sort of red flags and unanswered questions in the hearing, because it gets addressed a little bit in this latest episode of the podcast, but sort of briefly towards the end of the episode where she's talking about, trying to get to the bottom of this. And this is the rare point in the podcast where McCrae Dowless, who had pretty much declined all of her interview requests, there's an audio clip of him on the phone saying, yeah, I don't have Horace Munn's number. I don't think he's ever been to my office before. And then this, insinuation that maybe someone saw a different black man walking into McCrae Dowless's office, and that's where this suspicion gets raised. And perhaps the reason this came up in the hearing in 2018 at all was just to sort of further raise suspicions about this other group. So it'll be fascinating to see if this particular topic comes up again later in the podcast, because it, like you say, if it's one of her big unanswered questions, I'd be surprised if it's just only addressed in this 1 5-minute segment of one episode.
And that's sort of how the episode ends, a little bit on a cliffhanger. So I suspect we're going to get more of that. What's fascinating to me is my biggest unanswered question, and the story I probably should have done and would love to go back and do someday, it is about Mark Harris. John Harris, his son, testifies that he warned him about McCrae Dowless. They had multiple conversations. He sent emails. John Harris works for federal. He's in the U.S. Attorney's Office. He clearly knows what he's talking about. He's a lawyer. And before Mark Harris could ever really explain the story, he ended up being taken off the stand and then deciding that he would call for a new election, and the hearing ended. That is my giant unanswered question. Is sort of that, if I could do a special podcast, would love to know about the decisions that Mark Harris made, given the information that he had, given that his son had said, don't do this, and that he went ahead and did it. I would have loved for the trial or the hearing to have continued just a little bit more to tease that out.
Yeah, and that's one thing Zoe said to me in the interview, is that, she was sort of sitting on in disbelief at that when that was said, that Harris claimed he had no knowledge of this ahead of time. And of course, in the years since, Harris has kind of faded from the political scene. You don't really see or hear or read anything about him. And he also wasn't charged with any sort of wrongdoing. McCrae Dowless has pending criminal charges. Harris has not been charged with any wrongdoing in this case. So that's the interview I'd love to hear, is, Harris looking back on this 2 years later and maybe, spelling out a little bit more what he knew and what he didn't, now that, his potential seat in Congress is no longer on the line.
The other interesting thing, and this obviously is getting a lot of attention now, given what happened in 2020, and this story is still interesting to lots of people. McCrae Dowless still faces some sort of trial. I mean, he's been indicted. There, in theory, should be some trial at some point here in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And like a lot of things in federal courts, it tends to take forever. In the meantime, I think someone pointed out, it was the last year, the year before, he was actually on the ballot for a seat on the Soil and Water Commission in Bladen County, which was the elected office that he held throughout a lot of this time. Somebody was pointing out that they learned who cast the first absentee ballot in Bladen County in either last year or the year before his election, and it was McCrae Dowless, because he hasn't been tried yet, so he's not considered a criminal. He still has all his rights to vote and run for public office, and still seems to be a interesting figure in Bladen County politics for sure.
I'll leave you with this question, and you're someone who you cover the entire state. I mean, I know you read lots of small papers all across the state. I know you travel the state pretty extensively. How many other Bladen counties are out there? There's 100 counties in North Carolina. How many counties is something similar to this happening in? Or did we really stumble on the one place in North Carolina where this is, rampant?
Oh, I think a lot of these small counties have this dynamic. A lot of it, I think, is going to come down to the counties that have this particular racial dynamic, where you have, the more the white population in a lot of these small rural counties shifts Republican, the more there's this partisan divide between them and the Black community in these places that tends to skew Democratic. And the more you've got close to a 50-50 split or a 60-40 split between the racial makeups, and we've got a lot of counties in eastern North Carolina that have a sizable African-American population that sort of exceeds the 20% or so of the overall state population. And I think anytime you have that dynamic, you're going to have the seeds of this distrust. And you've seen this in a couple other sheriff's races over the years. I think Columbus County sort of comes to mind, Bladen's next door neighbor, as one of these where these sort of tensions boil up to the surface. So I think it's only a matter of time before it happens somewhere else. And I think the fertile ground for it really is these, racially mixed, politically polarized small rural counties east of I-95.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating, and certainly this window into what's happening in Bladen, which, we talk a lot about the political, what's happening in Bladen, that gets a lot of news in the rest of the state, but Bladen County's been hit extremely hard by a series of these hurricanes, never having really recovered from the first one before getting hit, I believe, by Florence. There are some other issues happening in Bladen County. We talk about Bladen County's through a political lens a lot. On the ground there, a lot of these residents are suffering.
Yeah, and they're close to that. If you recall the Keymore's PFAS spill, the chemical spill into the water supply in the Cape Fear River, that's right on the edge of Bladen County. So there's environmental issues down there. There's a lot going on, and it sort of escapes the state's attention unless a major election is at stake.
Well, thanks, Colin, for joining. That'll wrap up our special episode of Under the Dome about the serial podcast on the Bladen Improvement Association. We'll have a new episode of Under the Dome for each episode of the serial podcast. And we've got other coverage planned at newsobserver.com. For the News and Observer, I'm Brian Murphy, saying see you next time on Under the Dome.
For more from our politics team, subscribe to the News and Observer at newsobserver.com/subscribe. Follow us on Twitter at Under the Dome and NC Insider, and sign up for our weekly political newsletter at newsobserver.com/newsletters. Thanks for listening.